Welcome to Psych Incubator and Eminent Psychotherapists Revealed, a production of Strategic Psychotherapeutics. We are pleased and honored to feature Dr. Ronald Levant, a professor emeritus of psychology at the University of Akron. He's the past president of the American Psychological Association and APA Division 51, the Society for the Psychological Study of Men and Masculinities, and a two-term editor of APA Division 51's quarterly journal, Psychology of Men and Masculinities, a feminist scholar with over 20 books and countless referee journal articles and book chapters to his credit. He is widely considered to be one of the key people responsible for creating the new field of psychology of men and masculinities. Dr. Levant, welcome to Eminent Psychotherapists Revealed.
Thank you, Dr. Magnavita.
Well, thank you, Dr. Levant. I've been following your work for some time now, and I'm curious as to what really got you interested and involved in the study of men and masculinity.
Well, I recently wrote my memoir. It's called The Problem with Men. And in it, I reveal that I'm a trauma survivor. I was physically and emotionally abused by my father from the age of 2, bullied by anti-Semitic boys from the age of 5. And like many abused children, I became a delinquent as an adolescent. I was arrested for drunkenness and vandalism at the age of 15. I was expelled from high school at the age of 17. How did I get from there to here? Well, there were a couple of things that helped me. One, I had the most wonderful mother you can imagine. She was a terrific woman, bless her heart. May she rest in peace. And I was raised, during World War II. My father was in the Navy, and for the first 4 years of my life, it was basically my mother and me, and then when I was 2, my brother. And I think the kind of mother I had caused me to really have strong belief in myself. That I like many abused children, believe that they deserve what they're getting. I did not. I did not. And, just give you a small example, 2 examples of that. One, I was getting beat. I was getting jumped by groups of boys. They would say, "There's the kike, let's get him." And, they would jump on me. So around 8 or 9, I joined the YMCA and took a boxing class and, learned how to defend myself. And my uncle gave me a set of weights. So I lifted weights and got stronger. And I was mowing lawns. I bought a punching bag so that, the next time one of these groups said, "There's the kike, let's get him," I said, "Fine, bring it on." And one boy stepped up, and in 3 punches, I had him on the ground. And after that, the word got around that, hey, that kike can fight. And it kind of stopped. And my father is another story. I mean, he continued to abuse me. Here's one example. Again, around I was 8 or 9. My uncle had given me a Grundig Majestic shortwave radio as my prized possession. I lived in Southern California, and I was able to get Memphis and listen to the Johnny Otis show and listen to some of the early rhythm and blues music. And I love rhythm and blues music. And I also built model airplanes, and that was another way I made money. My family, was very tight on money, and every penny went into savings so that my father could buy a print shop. He was a printer. He wanted to be a small businessman. So I had to get my own money. So I would make these model airplanes, with the balsa wood and the tissue paper. And I had just finished one, and I was listening to the radio, and I had just finished it. I didn't put the skin on it, which is the tissue paper, but I built the structure, and I hung it up over my bed. And this, like one of many examples. We lived in a small 1,300 square foot home, but my father would clump, down, the stairway from his bedroom to mine, screaming, "God damn it, Ronnie." That was his tone of voice. He burst into my room. He grabbed that airplane that I had just completed, smashed it in his hands, and then he picked up the radio and he threw it at me. And I hit the floor. The radio went through my window and was destroyed. This is the kind of father that I live with. So when I was 13, um, we got into an altercation and I actually beat him up. I had him on the ground and I was punching him in the face, and his nose and mouth were bloody. And I actually had a girlfriend at the age of 13. I was kind of precocious. I went over to her house, and she had an older sister who had a boyfriend who was 17, and he had a car and I had a plan. I had a friend who had moved from Southgate, where I lived, to Texas. And um, I somehow persuaded a 16-year-old and a 17-year-old to drive me from Southgate to Texas. And when we finally got there, the car was giving them trouble on the way out there. And by the time we got there, their transmission was toast. But I called my friend. He took me in. I got a job stacking hay. I got a room, a room in a rooming house. And I was determined not to go back. And I kept this up until I got sick. I got a cold that turned into bronchitis. So I called my mother. I got a bus ticket and went home. And my father never laid a hand on me after that. So, so one of the reasons I didn't become a criminal or dead, which were kind of the options, I guess, that was facing me, was, kind of the love that I received from my mother. But also, I had a lucky accident. I had graduated, well, got kicked out of high school, so had to move to another high school. Um, I graduated from that high school. What was I going to do after high school? I'm looking at brochures. Do I join the Marines or the Army? And a friend came by and he said, "I'm going to Los Angeles City College to take the admissions test. Would you please come along with me?" I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, I'm kind of nervous. It's college and it'd be good to have a buddy there." I said, "Well, sure." So I'm not going to sit there, for an hour while he's taking a test. I took the test, got in, and discovered that I was actually good at something besides getting into trouble. I was good at math. I took trigonometry and 2 semesters of calculus and really loved it, and got a lot of encouragement from the faculty. And at a junior college, faculty have master's degrees, they don't have PhDs. But these were, you know, good teachers. They encouraged me. And after a year and a half at Berkeley, at City College, I got into Berkeley, the
Wow.
flagship school of the University of California system.
Wow.
So that kind of was what launched me into a different life. But anyway, that was a very long answer to your
No,
question.
but can you tell us, Ron, what uh, masculine studies, like, fill us in on what that means?
Let me just make
Study of
one point.
masculinity. Yeah.
So one of the reasons I study men and masculinity is to
Okay.
understand why some men
Hmm.
are such abominable human beings like my father. And that was kind of the
Oh,
mode. We
okay.
say we say research is often me search. And
Mm-hmm.
in this case, I really wanted to understand
Mhm.
why a man would behave in that way. So, what is the psychology of men and masculinities? Well, it was developed in the uh, late 60s and early 70s. Joe Pleck, David Brannon, Jack Sawyer, were among the early pioneers, and it leaned heavily on feminist psychology. And feminist psychology makes the distinction between sex and gender. Sex is basically your biological sex and all the things that go with it. Gender is a social construction. It's a gender role. It is embedded in culture, and it changes with culture and historical era. There's a book I could show you written by E. Anthony Rotundo saying American masculinity, transformations from the revolution to the modern era. The kind of masculinity you have now is not the same as it was in the 1700s.
Mhm.
So masculinity therefore becomes something that you could really study as psychologists. So the way and Joe Pleck really wrote the sort of the starting book on this. His book was titled The Myth of Masculinity.
Mm.
Joe and I both got our doctorates from Harvard, but in different programs. Harvard has a tradition of killing its clinical psych programs every few years. The scientists don't like it, whatever. So Joe was in the clinical program just before mine, and mine was called Clinical Psychology in Public Practice. So I didn't know him at Harvard, but I knew him later, and I did a postdoc with him when he was at Wellesley, and he had asked me to proof some of the chapters of the myth of masculinity. So that's kind of how I got involved in this. Was kind of got in on the ground floor, so to speak. But so it really tries to measure um, beliefs about how boys and men should think, feel, and behave. That's how we define
Mhm.
masculinity. It's a set of, therefore, social norms or gender norms is norms for thoughts, actions, and behaviors. And David Brannon developed the first scale to measure this. It has the unfortunate name, I don't know if it was Brannon or Pleck that coined it, but traditional masculinity ideology. I don't like that term because it sounds like communist or something like that. Um, and one of my collaborators and I have designed a study where we can kind of find a way to change it empirically. Um, uh, but in any event, Brannon developed a scale. He defined the norms of masculinity, which is an important beginning. His scale never uh, fared well psychometrically. Uh, and in the 80s, I developed a scale based on his called the Mail-Row Norms Inventory that actually, after a number of revisions, fared very well psychometrically. Um, so
And what does that measure, Ron?
it measures beliefs of any human. It's not just for men, women, transgender people.
Mhm.
Beliefs about how boys and men should think, feel, and behave.
Can you give us an example of like a question or two, just like to give us a
Sure.
drawing?
Basically, it consists of a series of statements,
Uh-huh.
and the respondent is asked to indicate the extent to which they agree or disagree on
See.
a 7-point scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree. So there's statements like the President of the United States should always be a man.
Hmm.
Um, Men should not show fear in their face. Men should not express affection to other men. You know,
Hmm.
uh, I can read you. I can, if you want me to, I can pull up the
No,
question.
that's helpful. I think that helps us understand what,
Yeah,
what you're getting at there. Yeah, good.
yeah. So one of the norms that I think is very important, it's very germane to our discussion, is that you know men should not express emotions. Men should not cry. Men should not show fear. Um, and uh, Boys reared to conform to these norms. And then let me just say a word about that. Research has shown that many boys feel they're obligated to conform to the norms of masculinity, that they have no choice but to be masculine. And they get this message primarily from their fathers and from other boys. And it shows up even in preschool, but certainly in elementary school, and most powerfully in middle school when puberty hits and children become adolescents.
And the idea of men not being in touch with our emotions and free to express them. I know that in extreme cases, there may actually be there's some suggestion that might be almost a neurological basis to the concept of alexithymia, where a person, it's not just a male, but we
Yeah,
cannot actually identify the emotion and put it into words. It's like
exactly.
an emotional, the emotional, not only the emotional language isn't there, but whatever it is that we are tuning into. Can you say a little bit more about alexithymia
Sure.
and male?
Yes, thank
Yeah.
you. I was going to ask that.
Yeah. Would you want to ask something more about it,
No,
Jennifer?
I just want you to tell me more about it.
Oh,
As,
okay. Well, um, I set up a practice. I left. I had a position at Rutgers, and I left it because I was supposed to be the chair apparent, and the dean had promised to add faculty lines, and she reneged. So I was only there, I think, a year and a half or two. And I really hadn't moved from Boston to New Jersey because I wasn't yet sure that this was going to work out. I actually kept up a day a week practice while I was teaching at Rutgers. When I left Rutgers, I got a position at Harvard Medical School and I opened up a full-time practice. Back then we had the yellow pages. Your audience may or may not know what that is, but I had a big ad, counseling for men, as I really wanted to explore psychotherapy with men. And I also told my colleagues, send me the men that your women clients complain about. And I gave out my cards and I got, a practice full of men. Um, and they ranged in terms of the degree of alexithymia. Some men, um, you know, could experience the emotion. They knew what emotion it was, but they suppressed the expression of it. At the other end of the extreme, there were men who did not experience a discrete emotion, but rather experience only a bodily sensation that kind of represented the physiological component of the emotion. So they might speak of something like feeling a tight band across their forehead, or
Mhm.
butterflies in their stomach, or like their neck is stiff. So, it's a range of symptoms, from mild to severe. I did a study once trying to determine to what extent lexithymia was a result of suppression, repression, or dissociation,
Hmm.
because there is some
Mhm.
trauma
Yeah.
in
Mhm.
the socialization of boys. Um, and my sample was college students, who tend to be more on the healthy end of it, not all of them, but in general. Um, and it came out in this particular study to be suppression. And so these would be the men who experience the emotion, they know what it is, but they do not express it or show it. But
So
I
it's
have
more,
my,
so, as I understand it, suppression is more conscious than
yes, yes, yes,
repression. You're not even getting in contact with it. It's the anxiety and the emotions and unconscious. But suppression is you're damping it down to because you don't want to reveal how you feel.
yeah, we did two other studies, one using semantic priming and one doing using evoked potentials. I worked with a neuropsychologist on some of this.
Mhm.
And very few men aren't aware of their emotions, at least in the college student. See, you know, the way it works in a university is you have a research participation pool in the psych departments, and the students get course credit for participating in faculty research. So it's an easy way to get a sample, and that's kind of what we do, unless you have a grant, and then you can get a community sample. But yeah, so it does range. In my practice, as I said, saw some men that were severely alexithymic. Um, One of the things I did in the practice was, experiment with ways to help these men develop emotional expressivity. Um, and you'd have to do a sales job on them because, it's like first of all, you're going against the grain. This is not what they believe.
So there's some psychoeducation involved there in trying to
Right.
get them on board with why this is helpful to be able to use their emotional guidance system in their life.
Well,
Yeah.
and the question that I have about that is, um, when they come into therapy, you know, the challenges with them, the expressing the emotions, are they seeing that as being something that's a problem for them, and that's one of the reasons why they're coming into therapy? Or
Most of the
Mhm,
time, no. Most of the time, no. And they come in for other reasons. But I should tell you, most
mhm,
most of the men that I received in my practice were sent. They didn't wake up one morning and say, "My goodness, I have normative male alexithymia. I better call Dr. Levant." So here's one example. Um, this was a man who had been married for 15 years, and they had put off starting a family because he was frequently relocated by his company. And they finally reached a point where they felt they could have a stable residence,
mhm,
and they decided to start a family after being married for 15 years. And so the wife got pregnant, and she actually urged her husband to see a psychologist because he was expressing no emotions about his impending fatherhood. Now, anybody who's been a parent knows that expecting a child is going to give you a full range of emotions from utter joy to utter terror. It's just it's such a life-changing event to become
mhm,
a parent. And so he came to see me. So it was not hard to kind of sell him on the idea that developing a way to identify and express his emotions would be helpful because his wife wanted that.
right.
She expected that. Um, so this is kind of an example of how I have engaged these men. I wasn't successful in every case. No psychologist that I know is. I tried my best, and in some cases it can work out or not.
So, Ron, can you give us your perspective on this new generations of young people that are growing up as digital natives, where they spend so much time on screens and they have so little of this face-to-face. We call it in our practice exercising in the psychological gym in relationships,
Mhm.
looking at how other people respond and the back and forth of the interpersonal process. So
Mhm,
they don't have the emotional gym that you did growing
mhm,
up in, where you're out in the streets, and while it was tough, you learned how to exercise your emotional and your self-other faculties. How do you think that the current generation who is raised from very young on online um, apps and content, how do you think that affects the development of masculinity or
And the question, the other part of that is, how do you see that as being different from what we saw, say, 20 years ago? What you saw 20 years
question?
ago?
Yeah, good
Well,
question.
I really haven't kind of looked too much into the effect of screens, but I have looked quite a bit into young men and women.
Mhm.
And I think I wrote an article in the 90s called The Crisis of Connection Between Men and Women. And that was because the 90s were this decade of masculinity where Robert Bly, the poet, was
Yeah.
taking men out into the woods and having them reconnect with themselves and that sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing. Um, and it was also evident in the 90s, but it's really evident now that we have a crisis of connection between men and women. And, you know, and
Can you
here's
say
how
what,
I
can you say
understand.
what you, can you elaborate a little bit more, Ron, on what you
I'm
mean by
going
that?
to, yes, I'm going to. So here's how I'm going to give you a little bit of history that I think explains how we got from where we were to now.
Okay.
And it's more than 50 years of history. So going back to the 1950s, women had fewer rights than they do today. They could not get a credit card, for example. Um, and very few women were in the labor force, especially mothers of small children. Mothers of children under 6, the percentage of them in the labor force was in the single digits.
Mhm.
That was by 1955. By 1985, 50% of mothers of small children were in the labor force.
Mhm.
Women entered the labor force from 1955 to 1985 like a tsunami. And the next thing that happened, starting in 1965, is the divorce revolution, where divorces started to accelerate.
Mm-hmm.
And so that by 1985, again, same year, half of all marriages were expected to end in divorce. So put it all together. Women gain financial independence from men, and then they leave bad marriages in droves. This, by the way, led to the formation of what the precursor of what's called the men's rights movement. It was then called the fathers' rights movement, because the men at that point were angry and upset at being dethroned, of losing their patriarchal
Yeah.
authority,
Yeah.
and they wanted to fight back against that. So um, now, uh, fast forward to today. Um, Boys and men are doing more poorly relative to girls and women on every educational, health, and social indicator there is. For
And
example,
economic.
huh? What's
And
that?
economic. Economic too.
Yeah. Um, well, let me deal with these three, and you can
Mhm.
perhaps add the economic. But um, educationally, this isn't new. We've known for a long time that boys have more learning and behavioral problems in school than girls. Partly that's because boys' nervous systems mature more slowly than girls. And some people have advocated redshirting boys, having them start school a year later. But, and that's been going on for a long time. But the other thing that's happened educationally is basically women have entered colleges and universities, again in droves. Um, when I
Mm-hmm.
first started out teaching, most of my students were men. And, my first teaching job was at Boston University in the counseling psych program there. And I think they were virtually all men. Um, my last job at the University of Akron, it was hard to find a man. They were all women. And so that's at the graduate level. But we know from the statistics that women um, enter and complete college at rates far exceeding that of men. And they enter graduate and professional schools, law, medicine, business, at rates far exceeding men. So what happened in this period? Uh, there were numerous intergenerational conversations between mothers and aunts and daughters and nieces about how to navigate a world of changing gender relationships. Women essentially changed their gender role. When I was at Berkeley in the 60s, I knew women who were taking assertiveness training classes to overcome the effects of their gender role socialization to be dependent on and deferent to men. So women, had this major transformation of their gender role.
Hmm.
Nothing like that occurred for men. In fact, I did a chapter with one of my students where we had to review some literature, and it was clear from that literature that boys are still being raised the same way they were in the 1950s, to
Mm,
double down on masculinity, to man up, you know, big boys don't cry, all that kind of stuff.
mhm,
So,
mhm.
so I think, you know, we have this gigantic crisis of connection where, uh, and I don't know of a study on this, but anecdotally, we hear reports that young men are still living with their parents. They're not dating. We have anecdotal evidence of that. I read an article written by a young man online complaining that he's not going on dates anymore because they're too much like job interviews. The women, want
Yeah,
to know
I
what.
see that trend in my practice. A lot more males are, even educated males are living home with parents and not dating.
Yeah, yeah, they're ill-equipped to deal with empowered women.
So what do you do with that, Ron? How do you address this? I mean, it's a societal issue, right?
Yeah, I'm not a social engineer. I'm a psychologist. So how I deal with
But
it
it
is
starts with the
I try to
individual,
help the
right?
guy.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, in the therapy that I've done, I can easily relate to these men because I was raised the same way they were.
Hmm.
I had all the masculinity traits that any other boy born in living in the 1940s and 1950s had. I was
Hmm.
aggressive, I was tough, all that kind of stuff. Um, I was unemotional, you know. And I'll say to him, uh, but I've learned, and you can learn that I like to talk in the emotional realm because I am a psychologist. And I say, I know it's hard for you to kind of reveal vulnerability, but that really is, kind of the currency of relationships, of being able to talk about how we feel about things, how we feel about each other, to reveal our fears and our anxieties and and listen to our partner's fears and anxieties and offer empathy and support, and so I try to, encourage them in this way. And I say, um, I was raised just like you. I know how hard it is. So I don't know how to do it on a social level. I wish I did.
Yeah. Well, and I was also thinking about the intersection of race and gender. And as I was listening to you and you were talking about the 50s, but it's really interesting because the Black women were working, right? We were working, but we were not doing professional jobs.
Hmm.
So we were the housekeepers and the nannies and, you know, the
And you
cleaning.
had no other choice but to work.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Black women had limited opportunities in that regard.
Hmm.
Yeah, the, I have not worked much with Black patients. I've had a few,
Hmm.
um, but where I was located, I was in Brookline, Massachusetts. It's predominantly a white area. It is near Roxbury, which is a Black area,
Right.
but I didn't have many I had very few Black patients. But I've had Black students, who one who are doing PhDs, and one in particular, Baron Rogers. I'll give a shout out to him. He's at University of Pennsylvania now. Um, he developed a very ingenious way to study masculinity in black men.
Hmm.
Basically, he came up with about 17 or 18 questions, and he collected his data initially in barbershops, which is a communal place for black men.
That's
and
correct.
and
Right.
in all ages, it's so you get the older guys and the younger guys, and a lot of mentoring and a lot of good things goes on in barbershop. So he went to barbershops with his little tablet where he had the survey on it, and would get these guys. And how he set up the survey was to get at the intersection of gender and race. So he had 17 questions which were about, what a man should think, feel, and behave.
Hmm.
And so he asked, how should a man do this? And how should a man feel about this? And so on and so forth. Then that was the first part of the questionnaire. And the second part of the questionnaire was he changed it to a black man.
Mm.
Yes, the same identical questions. How should a
Hmm.
black man feel? So he got right at the intersection between gender and race. And from that, he developed what he calls the Rogers African American Masculinity Scale. And what he found was, that black men or African American men have a view of masculinity that includes what the dominant one that white men have, but they also incorporate Afrocentric values of
Hmm.
community and family and leadership and loyalty. So that was one of the subscales. One or two of the subscales were African American or Black values. Um, and his scale was very, very good. Here's another cool thing about him. Um, we have this technique that didn't exist when I was a graduate student, and I actually learned it when I stepped down from being a dean, called structural equation modeling. And it's very, very difficult and very, very tricky.
Hmm.
Barron wasn't able to take a class in it. He learned how to do it on YouTube.
Of course.
And that's kind of also a millennial thing. But apparently, you can learn anything on YouTube. But he learned structural equation modeling on YouTube. He didn't have it quite right, but he did a damn good job. And I finessed it a little bit. But um, one takeaway from that is that African American masculinity is not the same as mainstream masculinity. It incorporates values that are specific to the African American community.
Well, and it's really interesting. And I think that part of that would also depend on how you're raised, right? Like, if
Mhm.
you are raised within that, that Black community thought process, and not every person is. So,
Yeah, so his sample,
mhm.
was Akron. So we have a fairly large Black community in Akron,
Hmm.
and 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 uh, it ranges from kind of middle class to lower middle class.
Hmm.
Um, and the University of Akron has a fairly large enrollment of Black students. Um, so, um, I would think I don't know to what extent represents African American men across the country, but my guess is it's pretty good, you know.
So we're at a stage now where I think many of us are observing uh, significant identity struggles with people, teenager and 20s and even younger, and uh, it seems like as these norms have been disrupted in certain ways that you were describing so well, it seems like there's a lot more of what people are talking about, gender fluidity, not having entered any specific gender identification. And and I see a lot of really confused young people
Hmm.
because they, as bad as it was with having a standard out of the box identity that you're going to pass down to your kids. For many kids, you could grab onto that, and that could be your float to get you through. But now we don't have that so much anymore, and I don't really know what to make out of it, Ron. But could you comment on how this gender fluidity that we hear about all the time, is this an outcropping of what you were describing in terms of the cultural, generational, and societal transitions?
Well, the shorter answer is I really don't know. But I do know I can answer a part of it. Um, the part of it that I can answer is that we're really in need of a new definition of masculinity. You know, the old one, the tough, dominant, emotionally inexpressive, stoic, uh, uh, philanderer model just doesn't work anymore. And various models have been put forward, but I think it has to come from the grassroots. I think it has to come from men themselves and read rather than academics or, you know,
What I hear from the people that I'm working with often is, why do we need any gender roles? Why can't we just be fluid and be whomever we are? Why do we need a definition of a masculine or a feminine gender role? Why not just we are we construct our own identity and it's fluid?
well, um, that's a fairly radical idea. It's actually one I
Hmm.
favor. I was offered the thing I said as kind of a middle ground, but I have an op-ed that I've just sent to actually to the Washington Post. Um, it's titled "Man Up, Be a Woman, or Simply Be Human." So
Mm.
the idea is, you know, the message that a lot of boys still get is
Yep.
man up.
Yes.
Um, and it's really a very problematic the way that it comes across. Um, but when you talk about the problems of boys adopting this code of masculinity, the first answer you get, well, what do you want the boys to do? Be more like women, knowing that's going to end the argument. So you know, in my op-ed, I said, and by the way, I wrote this with a collaborator, Chris Kilmartin. I've written a lot of op-eds with him. He's a psychologist in Virginia. Um, and what we said is that the argument is framed incorrectly on the assumption that there are, you know, very large differences between the sexes.
Hmm.
And that's, you know, it's based on a belief that men and women are so different. And there was this popular book in the 90s called Men Are From Mars, Women Are From
Yes.
Venus, which is,
Right.
you know, really, it was so thin the words just fell off the page. I mean, there was no substance to it. The psychological research, like that of Janet Hyde, for example, University of Wisconsin, who's been studying this for many years, is that if you take a look at any psychological attribute and compare men and women or boys and girls on it, um, the the differences are either trivial or small, and that's in terms of kind of effect sizes. Um, the, the, but I should say that psychologists have been preoccupied with the psychology of sex differences. When I was a graduate student, there was this 2 volume book on the psychology of sex differences, where one volume was references, just a whole volume of references. So it's been a preoccupation of
Hmm.
American psychology. And there are many, many, many studies, whether you're talking about mathematical ability, whether you're talking about um, uh, friendship ability, I mean, just a whole range of traits. And um, So if these differences are so small, why do we exaggerate them and make gender roles out of them? And
Well,
when and
isn't there like an evolutionary basis for that? I mean, a lot of what I've read it from evolutionary psychology or is that this these roles evolved in us because of differences in body types and pregnancy and child rearing that the women when they were pregnant had to stay close to the fire and tend to the fire, and the men were able to go out and do the hunting, and there was a differentiation in sex roles from early on in our evolution. Is that
yeah, that's true, but I think we're no longer, hunting mastodons and sitting around the fire and that sort of thing. I mean, we've been civilized. How far back does the first civilization at the Tigris and
well,
Euphrates
it's
go
kind of questionable how civilized we are when I look around the world right now.
back? Okay, you're right. I use that term advisedly, but we're not hunting wild beasts. Um, no, I think, certainly in the beginnings of our species, the sexes were probably differentiated based on their strengths and abilities and had different roles. But, we're living in the 21st century, and, physical strength is not a prerequisite to survival. Um, you can, and women and men obviously differ in that regard.
Yes.
So I would say that, and this is where I think uh, the evolutionary psychologist thing falls apart because it really doesn't describe contemporary people. And I think contemporary people are better defined by gender roles and social roles and norms and things of that nature, which can change. They do change. Um, So going back to your original, not original, your point a few minutes ago, I think we'd be better off if we did away with gender roles,
Okay.
and rather than having, a masculine and a feminine, of just people, showing up as who you are,
Well,
and this goes to the parents. I often, when I have an opportunity, say to parents, if your little boy is not tough and dominant, he's kind of kind and sweet and he likes to take care of his baby sister, let him. Let him be who he is. You know.
I was just sitting here. Thank you for this conversation, but I'm just sitting here thinking about this, and I'm thinking about the NFL, for example,
The what?
the
The
National Football League.
NFL. Oh.
Yeah, the NFL, the National Football League, and it's like just think about how much airtime they get, and the stands are full, and what are we seeing there?
Yeah, I'm an ambivalent football fan. And I'm getting I sort of kind of latched on to the Cleveland Browns
I'm
of
sorry.
maybe a, yeah, I know.
But
Uh,
are you,
couple,
Jennifer, talking about the hyper masculinity of it?
I'm talking about the hyper masculinity of it and how the crowds get into it, and it's like,
Testosterone.
yes. And
I'm starting to
the
sour.
TV time and the amount of money that people are spending on these.
Oh, I know. I'm starting to sour on it because some of the players I have particular affection for are suffering horrible injuries. And like Nick Chubb, who's kind of one of the leading running backs, who fought for over a year to recover from knee injury, recently broke his foot.
Mhm.
Um, and we have a quarterback who has one of the largest, I guess, largest contracts at that time, 230 million guaranteed over 5 years, who's played a total of, I think, 9 games in the 3 years he's been here because of injuries. And my wife and I watch the games on Sunday on the TV, and I'm just getting more and more disaffected because You got these 270 to 350-pound guys
Yeah.
running at each other at full speed. How can there not be injuries?
But the point I'm trying to make is the world is embracing
Yes.
masculinity, and
Yeah.
it's like
Yeah.
it is, they're trying to spread it beyond the United
Yes.
States. And
And can I circle back along the lines of what you're talking about, what Jennifer's talking about, Ron, that the sex differences,
right.
aren't there differences in testosterone? Like all the people that seem to be starting wars or carrying on wars seem to be men.
Well, let's talk about testosterone. Testosterone, estrogen, progesterone
Mm-hmm.
circulate in the bodies of all humans,
Mm-hmm.
irrespective of sex. Testosterone is necessary for aggression, but there's no dose response relationship. So, studies that have been done with non human animals, I think these studies were done with elephant seals, but there are others. Uh, you can give an animal 200 times the normal dose, and there's no increase in aggression. So the idea that that because males have greater levels of testosterone than females, they're more aggressive. I don't think the evidence shows that. The other thing the evidence shows from non-human studies is that social factors are more powerful than testosterone. Take chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are a very aggressive species, very unlike their close cousins, the bonobos, who
Mm-hmm.
simply are very a very sexual species. But the chimpanzees, once they've kind of have elected a leader of the troop, which is always a male, the fighting stops. There's, basically the fact that there is a hierarchy imposed on the group serves to uh, reduce the aggression with them. So social factors, I think, are more important. I think it's really not. I mean, I'm a psychologist, not a biologist, so obviously I'm biased to think of social factors and psychological factors. But I've looked into the testosterone argument with regard, specifically with regard to aggression, and I don't think it holds up.
So why do you think it's all these men who start and fight
Right.
wars?
Why do I what?
Why do men always seem to start and fight wars?
Patriarchy. Men, we live in a patriarchy. Look, men hold the powerful positions. How many women generals have there been in American history in the U.S. military? I don't, I think there might have been some two-star or three-star. How many, uh, you know, women lead corporations? And our CEOs, I think recently I looked at it, it was like 5.3% of the Fortune 500 companies, and it hadn't changed in 10 years. So, um, to me, a better explanation for that is patriarchy, which is a very old form of social organization, goes back to the beginning of humankind, and still exists.
Hmm. And so, do you want to comment
But
at
I think
all?
it might be good for your audience if we
Yeah, we
talk a
only have
little bit
five
more
minutes.
clinically.
Yeah, we have
Yeah.
5 minutes. Why don't you?
Okay, so look, let's talk a little bit about because this might be of interest. How do you treat emotionally inexpressive men? So the method I've developed, I found that emotionally inexpressive men often have very poor vocabularies for emotion words. So I first encourage them to develop a vocabulary of emotion words, and I will uh, rely on men's competitiveness and say something like, "The client I saw in the last hour came in with 30 words, and I
Mm-hmm.
can be assured that this guy's going to come in with 31." So I have them develop vocabulary. Secondly, I found it's easier to teach them to identify emotions in other people than it is to identify their own emotions. So I teach them about facial expression, tone of voice, body language, paralinguistic things like sighs, cries, and gas. I ask
Mm-hmm.
them, when you're talking to somebody, or even if you're watching TV, ask yourself the question based on what you can observe from their face, their tone of voice, what are they feeling as they're saying this? Once they've got that down, I ask them to turn to their own emotions. And as I said, some men that I've treated actually cannot identify it as emotion. It's a bodily sensation. So I'll say, when you're experiencing an emotion, or if it's a guy who's only bodily, or a bodily sensation, write it down. Keep an emotional response log. Write down what you're experiencing. Next, consider who is doing what to whom at that moment and how does it affect you. Write that down. Then go through your list of emotion words and pick out the word or words that describe how you're feeling. So here's an example. Butterflies in my stomach. I was expecting feedback on a report I turned into my supervisor at noon, and it's now 1:30. Word or words, apprehension, maybe anxious. So this may sound like emotional kindergarten, and in a way it is.
Well, it's what Goldman talks about in emotional intelligence, right? The components of emotional intelligence are being able to recognize the sensations, have the affect labels, and use that to develop psychoeducation about
Yeah,
emotional.
it is. It's psychological education. It's similar to emotional intelligence, but it's specifically designed for alexithymic men, um, to enable them. And it's amazing what a difference it makes in psychotherapy, because every form of psychotherapy requires that the patient engage with their emotions. And if the
Mm-hmm.
patient doesn't know what they're feeling, they're at a handicap. Even exposure therapy, the most behavioral treatment there is, requires that they identify different levels of anxiety in response to threatening stimuli. So if you can help a patient, you can empower a patient to put their emotions into words, they can get a much greater uptake from psychotherapy than without it.
Yes, good, very
Right.
good
That's
advice.
true.
So in the time we have left, we often ask, what advice do you have for early career psychotherapists and clinicians?
Well, what worked for me is pick a niche.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Like I said, I set up my practice counseling for men. Yeah. Now, here's the thing. Most men don't want to go to psychotherapy. It's a hard sell. And like I said, the vast majority of the patients I've seen were sent by someone, a partner, sometimes an employer, a relative.
The
Uh,
legal system,
what's that?
the legal system sometimes.
Legal system. But pick a niche. I mean, that happened to be my niche. But I think the best way to pick, don't be a generalist. That that'll will not differentiate you and not make you identifiable. You want to be known for something. The other thing is, get known in your community. Write op-eds for your local newspaper. Give talks to community groups on psychological topics. These are ways to get yourself known
Mm-hmm.
as a helpful person, and make the op-eds and the topics that you talk about things that are of interest to your community, and obviously that varies by community.
Well, Dr. Ron Levant, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your wisdom and your time with us. I think this was
Thank
very
you.
interesting, and we hope to have you back another time to talk more about masculine studies and your clinical experience and your scholarly work. This was awesome.
It was great. Thank you, Ron.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jeffrey and Jennifer. Jennifer's an old friend, and I'm getting to know Jeffrey, and hopefully he'll become an old friend after time. So it was a pleasure to be on here, and thank you for having me.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Mm.